Okay, well, it's my honor to give everyone attending this webinar a warm welcome. Special thanks to our expert presenters in conversation, Haim Bresheeth, author of An Army Like No Other, plus Antony Loewenstein, a freelance investigative writer, filmmaker, and co-founder of Declassified Australia. Antony has written for The Guardian, The New York Times, and many others. We are particularly honoured that Antony has chosen JNP and the Convivencia Alliance's platform from which to launch his latest book, The Palestine Laboratory. Please watch out for the link to buy his book, which will be posted in the chat. We also appreciate he agreed to get up in the wee hours in order to join us from Australia. So thank you, Antony. Excluded. Finally, I must mention the increasingly extreme events in Israel-Palestine, which are not only hugely concerning, but may also present opportunities to disrupt the dominant Zionist narrative. We must all redouble our efforts to promote a sustainable, just peace at this fragile time. And with that, Haim and Antony, the floor is yours.
Good evening, and a special welcome to Antony at 4 o'clock in the morning in Australia. There is commitment for you. Now, I'm going to ask Antony a series of questions, having read his incredible book, which I hope you will read very soon. And I hope that Antony will also come to Britain so we can have him in an in-person meeting in the near future. My own work is obviously connected to this, so I have a special interest in the book, but I feel that the book is of interest to anyone who has interest in international politics. And as Antony is a professional writer, it's an enticing read, and you can't lay it down until you're finished with it. So I hope all of you will take our word for it and read the book. So Antony, I've arranged some topics to attack through what you have written. Now, the first one is, we all know that Israel is selling to enormous numbers of countries. So could we actually get an idea of, how many countries are buying their weapons from Israel through to when the book is out, or for now, if you know. My own count was 135 at the time, but it must be higher now. And also, can we speak about what it takes for a regime to be supplied for Israel? For example, is a regime ever refused? Are dictatorships refused? Are fascist dictatorship refused, etc.? Is Israel also selling to other entities apart from states? And the bottom line is probably, how much money is it worth to Israel annually?
Thank you, Haim, for that. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and I really appreciate being able to have this opportunity. It is early in the morning here, but it's worth it. So thank you. Some facts, sure. So Israel is now regarded as the 10th biggest arms dealer in the world. The US is number one. It's been number one for a long time. It's about 40% of the world's weapons is sold from the US. Numbers, and in the other top 10, I'm talking about Russia, France, and other countries. So Israel is not number one, but it's in the top 10. And just recently, Israel released its 2022 figures. It was 12.5 billion US from last year, and a quarter of which was to Arab countries. So that really gives you a sense that so much of the so-called Abraham Accords, which was pushed by Trump in, I think, 2018, was really an arms deal, essentially, which was, many people would said that at the time, but countries like UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, unofficially Saudi Arabia, were all desperate to buy Israeli weapons. And when I mean weapons, I'm talking principally about spyware and other kinds of surveillance technology. Are there any countries that Israel does not sell to? Well, sort of, yes, but very few. As far as we're aware today, Israel's not selling to, say, Iran as a state, Syria, North Korea. There's a handful, but very, very few. Of course, as I say in the book with great detail, Israel and Iran were very close friends before 1979 during the Shah, and sold huge amounts of weapons to the regime. And in fact, as the Islamic Revolution was brewing in 1979, the Israeli officials, and I document this in the book through declassified documents, were concerned that the relationship would end or be curtailed with a change of regime, and weapons was a key part of that concern. And, one of the things I really tried to set out in the book was to show that in the modern era, I'm talking here about the 21st century, as far as we're aware, based on declassified documents, based on experts that I spoke to, based on my own research, Israel has pretty much not rejected any serious application to sell weapons to any regime around the world, including far-right dictatorships, fascist dictatorships, theocratic states. There are no barriers, really, in practice. And on one level, that's not unique to Israel. Of course, the US is very similar. The US sells to pretty much anybody, as does Russia. I mean, the arms industry is itself amoral. That's the nature of the arms industry. And many argue that, along with the illicit drug trade, it's the two most corrupt industries in the world. And one expert I have in the book, Andrew Feinstein, is actually a London-based expert on the arms trade from South Africa originally, says that he's calculated that roughly 40 to 50% of the global arms trade is based around corruption. In other words, greasing of palms, corruption to officials, etc. And Israel is part of that. I mean, I talk in the book extensively about huge numbers of regimes over the last half century that have sold equipment from Israel. You quote Haim before 135. My tally was around the same. Roughly 135 countries, give or take, in the last half century, principally since 1967, although the industry started before then. It started in the 50s, which we can talk about if you'd like later, but essentially the majority of nations on the planet. And the ones that Israel has not sold to is not principally because of any concern over human rights. It's just for a range of other reasons. But the aim is to sell weapons to as many nations as possible. And we can talk about why that is. But I see the Israeli arms industry very much as a way for Israel to ensure almost like an insurance policy. That's how I view this, as in the hope that they will get huge amounts of support globally, and the arms industry provides that kind of insurance.
Could you also speak about the range of products, and especially the cyber products and the telephone products that have become very famous that Israel is producing, and also speak about the concept of the laboratory that your book is called after?
So when I said before that Israel is the 10th biggest arms dealer in the world, that's true. But in terms of cyber, both mostly offensive weapons, Israel's in the top 3. And what we mean by that, obviously, most famously, is Pegasus, which most people will have heard of in the last years, which essentially is a phone hacking tool. And for those who don't know what that means in a practical sense, years ago, it required that a government, a military, an intelligence service required the way that the technology was installed on your phone is you would get some random text message talking about, something bizarre. You click on it, you forget about it, you move on. But that, in fact, is what infects your phone. These days, it doesn't even require that so-called zero-click infection, which means, in a practical sense, that all they need is your phone number. And Pegasus is the most well-known of that, but there are many, many others, many other Israeli companies that are doing exactly the same thing. And in fact, in the last years, as NSO Group, the Israeli company that's behind Pegasus, has run into some political problems and financial problems. The company itself is in financial dire straits. There are many other companies that have come up, many other companies, I should say, that have come up to replace them, or certainly to complement them. And what became clear in the researching of this book was that in the last roughly, Pegasus began in roughly 2011, so 15 years ago or so, a bit less than that, 12 years ago, that Israel has never refused a defense export for these tools, literally never. And one of the things that really frustrated me in the writing of this book was that so much of the media coverage in the last year around these questions framed Pegasus or NSO Group as some rogue company. They're not a rogue company. They're essentially an arm of the Israeli state. And just like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon are really arms of the US surveillance state used around the world to pursue US foreign policy agendas, whether it's in Ukraine, Iraq, or Afghanistan or elsewhere. NSO Group is exactly the same, to the point where Netanyahu, as prime minister, or the Mossad, go around the world holding Pegasus and other similar tools out as a diplomatic carrot, essentially saying to a nation, we'd like to be friends with you. If you're friends with us, we will sell you this unbelievably powerful spyware. And in return, we would like to have a different vote at the UN from you, or other kind of support. And that's how it's worked in country after country: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Rwanda, India. And I document all this in the book. So the cyber realm is something Israel's massively excelled at for a few other reasons. Briefly, one of the key intelligence units in the IDF is Unit 8200, which its day-to-day job is to monitor and surveil the Palestinians in Palestine, and also, frankly, in Israel itself. And one of the things that unit stresses at a leadership level is to encourage people to develop their own tools of surveillance that they can then promote and sell when they shift from the public sector to the private sector. And that kind of close relationship, again, not massively dissimilar to how it works in parts of the US surveillance state, ensures that, as I said before, when a company like NSO Group comes up, and a range of others, that they remain close to the state, and they're in fact used by the state to get intelligence on various allies and so-called enemies. And, Israel's cyber, experience, where, Israelis are in that unit day in, day out. Unit 8200 is the equivalent of the America's NSA. So the NSA is the most powerful intelligence unit in the world. And Israel's unit is not as big or powerful, but similar, and almost the rivals. And in fact, increasingly, what I show in the book is how some people may have heard in the last few years since Biden became president, he has put a ban of sorts on some of these Israeli spyware companies, NSO Group being the most infamous, and others, which on the face of it seems very positive. It seems to suggest the US actually takes seriously the idea that spyware is infecting people's phones around the world. But actually, I don't think it has anything to do with that. I see this very much as the US feeling like they want to protect their turf, and they're concerned that their own offensive cyber companies will be challenged in the international arena, and therefore want to try to crush Israeli competition. I see it very much as a capitalist issue rather than as a human rights issue.
Could you discuss the company called Global Comprehensive Security Transformation, and how that caused some problems and how it was resolved? Because that relates to what you just said.
So when South Sudan became independent in 2011, it's still the world's newest nation officially. There was a civil war there by 2013 between the two main ethnic groups. And I actually was living in South Sudan in 2015, reporting mostly for The Guardian, but other newspapers as well. And I did not know this at the time, but I've since discovered it, that Israel was selling surveillance technology to the South Sudanese regime. And just to be clear, the South Sudanese regime is one of the most brutal regimes. There has been mass ethnic cleansing against various ethnic groups in that country now for 10 years. There's been the displacement of huge numbers of people. There's been the death of huge numbers of people. And there was one Israeli company, so putting aside the government itself selling surveillance technology to one side in that war, which, although unsurprising, is deeply amoral considering the kind of South Sudan was also a US ally. And that's also a key point that's worth saying, which I discuss in the book extensively, that the US being the world's leading arms dealer, Israel's often America's wingman, so to speak, when it comes to the arms industry, where in so many examples, this really much started in the 70s particularly and has continued to this day, even in countries where the US is not selling weapons for a range of reasons, not because of ethical concerns, but because of some block in Congress or whatever it may be, Israel will often come in and fill that breach. And although the US was selling weapons to South Sudan and Israel was doing so similarly in the last 10 years, there was one Israeli company that particularly was selling weapons to one side. And during the Trump era, there were sanctions placed on that company. And as I say in the book, it's not really entirely clear why that was. It's not like during the Trump era, there was an explosion of morality in the US administration, or Trump himself particularly cared about what was happening in South Sudan. It was nothing like that, of course. But those sanctions were lifted, and those companies were still able to sell weapons to South Sudan. The reason South Sudan is relevant, among so many other examples in the book, I have South Sudanese friends who were not aware at the time that Israel was playing a part in a brutal civil war, is that it kind of, to me, goes to the heart of, and people on this webinar obviously won't accept this narrative, but this is how Israel still sells itself as somehow a beacon of democracy, or at least some kind of nation that is a light unto the nations, that is inspiring other nations. And when you see the dirty element of how the arms industry works, you realize that's, of course, nonsense, as people will know that clearly, but that's how Israel promotes itself. So that example in South Sudan, to me, is a fascinating one, because it's a conflict that barely gets any international attention. And we're not talking about huge amounts of money that Israel would get from a country that's not particularly wealthy at all. There's some oil wealth. When Sudan and South Sudan split in 2011, there was a massive disagreement about who would get the oil wealth, and a lot of it ended up in South Sudan just because of where the borders were drawn. But Israel was keen to play a part in that because it was a key US ally, and also strategically it was important in that part of Africa.
I wanted to also extend this to a nearby topic. Israel is presenting itself as a specialist because, of course, this is what your book is about. It's been tested on Palestinians. All the weapons come with that kind of guarantee, and not just Palestinians, of course. Is there a relationship between Israel's successes or failures in the field and successes in arms trading? For example, Israel failed in all the times it attacked Lebanon to achieve anything, apart from, getting rid of the PLO. Nothing else was achieved. Israel has badly failed in 2006. How does this success or failure affect sales? The fact that the same armaments have not really guaranteed Israeli success.
I compare it, Haim, to the US's war in Iraq and Afghanistan. On the face of it, both those wars are a catastrophe. I mean, obviously, the Afghan and Iraqi people would very much say that. But actually, for the US arms industry, those wars were huge successes. There's no doubt about that. They were very happy with the war. And in fact, to the point where when the US pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021, there was concern expressed by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, where's the next war going to come from? Often the CEOs were explicitly saying that. And when the war in Ukraine started a few months later, and I'm not suggesting the war started obviously for the arms industry, but since it has started in February last year, arms sales from those companies have soared that are being sent to Ukraine. So the wars in Lebanon, you're right, on the face of it, were a complete catastrophe for Israel, 1982, 2006. But actually, as I detail in the book, after 1982, Israel promoted that war as a wonderful example of Israeli technology and surveillance and weaponry. Now, you're right, Israel didn't really achieve any of its goals, but what was remarkable in that era was how many nations were desperate, not just for Israeli weapons, but so-called counterinsurgency experience. And after 1967, Israel, from its perspective, was regularly promoting itself as the master in how to manage a so-called occupied population. Now, obviously, they were talking mostly about Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and elsewhere. But you see in countless countries in Latin and South America, especially in that era, talking about Colombia, Honduras, Guatemala, all nations at that time that were committing grievous human rights abuses. In fact, in Guatemala, there was genocide being committed against its indigenous population. That many nations openly were saying, and privately were also saying, and I detail this in the book through declassified documents, were saying, and I'm paraphrasing here what they were saying, we want to get some of the experience. In other words, show us how to do it to Israel. Show us how to occupy, repress a population we don't want. And as crazy as it might sound, the 1982 war in Lebanon, which on the face of it was a catastrophe for Israel, and obviously for Palestinians and Lebanese, more seriously, Israel was promoting itself publicly and privately as the master of counterinsurgency, partly because of that war. And indeed, after the 2006 war with Hezbollah, which, as you say, was a catastrophe. I mean, clearly a catastrophe for the Lebanese, particularly because vast parts of Lebanon were destroyed. Israel was also promoting itself. So you have to understand that there's kind of a disconnect. On the face of it, it seems ridiculous that one could promote these kinds of wars as any kind of successes. But again, the US did that in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's exactly how they promoted those weapons from Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. So, inverted commas, success in any kind of objective way is not necessarily the only judge of how Israeli weapons is sold. And when you asked before about what the title of the book meant, which I haven't, I guess, haven't explicitly said, is that what I'm showing is that for decades and decades, and this started before 1967, but accelerated after that, after the beginning of the occupation of those territories, Israel has been using Palestinians as almost guinea pigs, testing a range of weapons, tools, so-called counterinsurgency methods, all these kinds of things. Now, obviously, in the modern era, we're talking about drones, spyware, facial recognition technology, biometric technology, all these kinds of tools and technologies to maintain the occupation and control Palestinians, and then promoting those tools and technologies as so-called battle-tested in Palestine on Palestinians. And I detailed that extensively, what that means practically. And huge numbers of countries are attracted to that, dictatorships and democracies.
And the book also is making the point that not only Israel's war are leading to great increase in sales, but other events, for example, the end of the Soviet Union, or especially 9/11. Can you discuss the increase in sales after 9/11, especially?
Yeah, look, 9/11 was really obviously a turning point for a lot of the world, tragically, but Israel, I mean, I have this quote in the book, which I've always reflected on. You know, I think the day of 9/11 or the day after, I forget now, but Netanyahu, who's not prime minister then, was on American TV. And he was asked about the events and what do you think and what does Israel think of this? Again, he was not prime minister at the time. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing, oh, it was very good. And the interviewer was like, sorry, what do you mean? And he goes, oh, I don't mean that people die, you know, that's not good. But basically, the world will now understand what Israel's been going through for decades. And to some extent, he was right. And what I mean by that was so much of what the US adopted after 9/11, both the language and policies in the so-called war on terror, was the Israeli playbook. There's just no question about that. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was remarkably similar. And I detail in the book what that practically means. And so much of the Israeli defense industry, the cyber offensive industry, particularly after 2009 or 10, very much used its experience in Palestine on Palestinians as a marketing tool to say, we have done this for years. We know how to manage terrorists. We know how to fight terrorists. We know how to kill terrorists. Follow us. Let us be your guide. And the Israeli arms industry surged after 9/11 across the globe. That the so-called war on terror, both in a practical sense, but also in a rhetorical sense, I detail this in the book, you know, the language that so many people in the US government, but also frankly in the media, used after 9/11 was very much the Israeli style playbook, using the kind of language of, not that there wasn't dehumanization of Arabs and Muslims before 9/11, of course there was, but it hugely accelerated after that. And the Israeli playbook, not just working with the US very closely, but also operating its own hugely successful defense industry, surged. And again, it was using the experience of the occupation as a key part of its armory, so to speak. I detailed this through huge numbers of examples and companies, and I won't go into all detail now, but 9/11 was a really key turning point. And I would argue we're still in that era now. It's 22 years after that event. And although in so many cases, not just the rhetoric, but the reality of those policies have been shown to be a complete disaster, Iraq, Afghanistan being the most obvious. You mentioned before, Haim, about the war in Ukraine. And since the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year, so now for a year and a half, there's been a huge surge in interest from European countries for Israeli technology, defense companies particularly, are doing very, very well. And those figures haven't been particularly reflected in the 2022 figures Israel's released, but will become clearer, I guess, roughly in a year's time when Israel releases its figures for this year. So, but again, it's finally on that point. You know, there's been stories in the press a lot, including in the FT a few weeks ago, that what's happening currently in Ukraine is also a key site of battle testing new weapons, that the US and Israel is pouring huge amounts of weapons into that conflict. Now, to be clear, Ukraine has wanted way more Israeli weapons, way more, including Pegasus. And Israel has decided not to sell them some of that technology, both during Netanyahu's time and also before that with Lapid and Bennett. And the reason for that is they're very keen to maintain good relationships with Putin and Russia, because they want to have free space in Syria to be bombing that country, particularly what they claim as Syrian or Iranian interests, and Russia controls the skies. So there's no real morality about, not that there obviously would be, but there's no morality about Israeli decision-making in Ukraine. It's just simply, I would argue, pragmatism.
You just answered my next question, so I'll move to the next one, and that is also to do with Ukraine. Haaretz reported a week ago that the sales to Europe have now surpassed the sales to the rest of the world, and Europe is the biggest client of Israel now. This is new; it has never been the case before. So I want to ask you about something that you said, and you seem to agree with Scott Ritter, that has very good sources normally. Scott was talking about this about 2 weeks ago, saying also that the fact that the American missiles actually don't shoot down the Russian missiles, the supersonic ones, has not stopped the American missiles being sold. But what did happen is that the European nations have started buying from Israel instead of the US because they trust more in the Israeli two types of missiles than in the American missiles. Can you say something about that?
I can, but before I get to that, it's worth saying that Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, both before the invasion and after, or during, has sort of expressed real admiration. He's Jewish, and he's expressed support for Israel over the years. He supported Israel's various wars against Gaza. He gave a very interesting interview last year, I can't remember the exact date when, but in 2022, of saying that he imagined in the future, I think he was talking about when the war is over, whenever that will be, that Ukraine will be like a big Israel. In other words, a highly militarized society, huge amounts of guns in the hands of Ukrainians, and was admiring, I guess, Israel's, this is my word, not him, but instead of implying so-called warrior spirit. I mean, he really talked about admiration about how Israel had set its society up. He didn't talk about the Palestinians, of course, it wasn't even mentioned, but he's talking, I guess, about the way in which Israel is a so-called battle-hardened society, and this is how Ukraine's going to have to be because we're going to have a big, ugly neighbor always on our doorstep, which is Russia. So I haven't seen, and I'm not suggesting that Scott Ritter is wrong, but I've not seen huge amounts of evidence that Ukraine's buying massive amounts of Israeli armaments. They want a lot more Israeli weapons, and they've expressed that very publicly, and I understand extremely often privately. It's only in the last relatively short while, in the last months or so, where Israel has started selling larger amounts of weapons to Ukraine, but they're principally so-called defensive weapons, not offensive, for the reasons I explained before, because they don't want to piss off Russia. And there's been massive amounts of pressure from the US, Biden and others to try to get Israel to be much more assertive in selling weapons. And obviously it'd be a huge financial gain for Israel. But what Israel has been doing instead is getting, as you said, huge amounts of sales to European nations. Traditionally, you're right, Europe was never number one in Israeli arms sales. They used to sell weapons to various European countries, but that's hugely expanded in the last 18 months. And we're talking about lots and lots of nations in Europe, which are, this is how they describe it, whether we accept this rationale is up for debate, but they fear Russian aggression. This is how it's framed. And they're looking to buy technology that is going to counter that. Missile defense shields, weapons, etc. I'm talking about Germany, Finland, and others. Partly neighbors of, well, not just neighbors of Russia, but in mostly Western Europe, some Eastern Europe too. And again, it frames Israel as the indispensable nation. The rationale is very clear. It's often said explicitly. You've been fighting a constant war. For example, you've been having to deal with missiles raining on your territory from Gaza. We would like similar technology to protect our country, whether it's Germany or elsewhere. So as I said, I'm pretty confident, as Israeli officials are as well when they talk about it, that 2023 arms sales are going to be higher. And as I said at the beginning of this conversation, the 2022 figures were 12.5 billion US, which is the highest ever. And almost certainly next year will be higher. And Europe is obviously a key purchaser of these weapons. But just to, so listeners are aware, so are lots of other countries around the world, Arab countries and Asia as well.
I just wanted to say that the figures of 12.5, etc., that you $12.5 billion, etc., are only the above the water figures that SIPRI in Stockholm is using. And we do know that they probably are nearer to half, and in some cases even less than half, because a lot of it is under the radar. I want to ask a question that relates to this financial aspect, and that is, Israel is getting the largest aid budget until the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and that's about 5 billion, less than 5 billion a year. Now, bearing in mind that it is probably making 4 times at least from arms dealing, and that the 5 billion is 1% of its GDP, do you think that Israel really needs this? Because some American senators and congressmen are now saying we should stop giving this money to Israel because it doesn't need it. Not in order to save money, but because they think it doesn't need it, and probably they will better send it to Ukraine. Will a move like this, in a sense, undermine Israel and its psychological factors of support, being supported by the US? You think it's likely, first of all, and do you think it will undermine support of the US?
I don't think it's hugely likely, because although you're absolutely right, in the last while, the voices supporting a cut to military aid from so-called liberal Zionist groups, J Street, to just this week, 2 former American ambassadors to Israel came out, including former Australian, well, I think he might still be Australian, Martin Indyk. I'm sorry that he's Australian, but he is. He has also called for a cut to military aid, almost as a way to hold it over Israel, to sort of say we have no leverage here, we being the US. But the truth is that there are huge numbers of American senators and politicians, and frankly media, who do support keeping military aid, not because they necessarily think that Israel needs it, but because it massively supports the American arms industry. I mean, so much of the military aid budget that goes to Israel is to basically allow the American arms industry to develop weapons every year. So, I mean, my own personal feeling is that that aid should have stopped, years ago, because it's not really aid at all. And in fact, increasingly, as some people will be aware, there's a growing voice amongst the Israeli far right to cut this aid. It's not just coming from the US. I remember the last few years, Caroline Glick, who's a far right, I think she lives in Israel now, but I think former American, who writes for far right publications, a sort of fairly prominent writer in the Israeli far right. She's been calling for years to cut the aid, saying, A, we don't need it, and B, we don't really want America. We don't want America meddling in our affairs. I mean, in my view, it's a fairly delusional view, not because I don't support the aid being cut, I do, but this idea that Israel could survive and thrive without massive American, not just financial support, because I don't think Israel particularly needs it, but diplomatic backing or protecting Israel in international forums, is delusional. I mean, ultimately, if America, for example, decided to not vote in a certain way in the UN or not block potential investigation of the ICC, you can be fairly sure that Israel would find itself in a lot of trouble. And although I support those moves, and you never know where Israel is going, how the US reacts, particularly, I mean, Biden he obviously has a history of being very, very pro-Israel, and I don't really see much evidence so far of that changing. I mean, terse words through Thomas Friedman in the New York Times isn't exactly what I would call pressure. I mean, this idea that it's sort of been so depressing to watch the international media in the last few weeks saying, oh, Joe Biden told Thomas Friedman that he's very concerned about Israel, as if Israel cares. I mean, like, that's your megaphone? Tom Friedman? Seriously? Anyway, it's just sort of delusional. And frankly, I think Israel does not really overly worry about that now. A, because I guess they're hopeful that Biden might lose next year at the election, which is far from guaranteed. But B, there's huge amounts of Democrats which are 110% behind Israel that want to maintain that military aid. So I think it's possible that the debate will and the pressure will grow to potentially either curtail military aid or cut it altogether. But I don't really see, in the short term at least, that aid being cut. I don't. I could be wrong, but I don't really see it being cut for all the reasons I just said.
I want to continue the same line. We all know that the IDF is a major player in the drama now unfolding in the Israeli political scene, especially the ex-chiefs of staff, the ex-Mossad chiefs, the ex-Shabak chiefs, and the ex-generals who speak against Netanyahu and his government everywhere. Now, I don't think that our audience is confused about this crowd and think that they are going to bring peace or anything similar. But can you explain this very complex relationship that exists between the army as such and all the people speaking in the name of soldiers, especially there is a group which is very aggressive towards anti-occupation demonstrators who are a tiny minority, but who are trying to join the main body of the demonstrations and are ejected by a group of reserve soldiers called Brothers in Arms, very, very aggressively. So this is a very strange situation, which is close to an IDF coup against the government. And yet this is the government that is cannot exist without the IDF. So how do you see this specific aspect of the drama in Israel?
It is indeed a really strange situation, because it's clear since the new government came into office in December last year that the rate of attacks against Palestinians, pogroms, is increasing, and that's only happening because large numbers of the IDF are allowing it to happen. I'm not talking about the leadership level always. I'm talking about the grunts on the ground, essentially. They're allowing it to happen. They're overseeing it. They're turning a blind eye. In fact, at times they're participating in it. There's no question about that. So it's clear that there's been a mass influx of settlers or settler supportive soldiers in the IDF in the last years, which has been one of the aims of the settler movement. So on the one hand, there's no doubt that there are growing numbers of people in the IDF, perhaps not at the leadership level, but in the main body of it, who do support what Netanyahu is doing, these so-called judicial reforms. They do. However, as you say, there's a weird situation where there are many others who do not, who still, and if you hear them speak, I mean, to our ears, it's delusional, but they sort of say they still do believe that they want Israel to be viewed not as a settler state, not as a state that somehow represents the far right extreme, but is somehow I mean, when you hear them talk, it is, to our ears, fairly bewildering that they want to maintain, I would argue, the illusion of a more civilized country, a nation that has not been overrun by far-right extremists, those who at least think and realize that that kind of will become an image problem for Israel. I don't think it's so much in a practical concern that they're somehow worried that this, they're losing sleep over this glorious Supreme Court they always talk about. I mean, people on this event will be aware of this, but to me, so much of this angst that we're seeing from the Israeli Jewish population over the Supreme Court is kind of bewildering in a way. Not because I support the so-called reforms that Netanyahu is pushing through. I think they should be opposed. But this idea that the Israeli population is trying to save the Supreme Court, I'm thinking, sorry, do you people not know the history of the Supreme Court in Israel? Of course, there's been, multiple decisions in the last 50 odd years, but in the vast majority of cases, those decisions have been rubber stamping the occupation. It's not some sort of liberal bastion. And I think for many in the IDF leadership, they want to hold on to the illusion, in my view, of a more liberal country. Now, they're not liberal necessarily themselves. They're not applying a liberal policy in the West Bank or definitely Gaza, but they want to hold on to that illusion, in my view, which I think they worry that will make it much more difficult for Israel to sell itself. I see this as a PR issue, principally. They would regard it obviously as a practical life and death issue, but it's not. I just don't see that practically happening, that somehow if these reforms go through, the IDF somehow becomes a divided body. There clearly are a lot of Israeli Jews who say, we're not going to serve in the reserves and we're not going to fight, and okay, fine, but what does that practically mean? There was an interesting article in Haaretz last week that made it pretty clear that a lot of this is also kabuki theatre. It's hugely kabuki theatre. That does anyone seriously think, I'm not saying on this call, I'm saying more rhetorically, does anyone seriously think that if there's, say, some war in the Middle East or some action against Gaza or some action against Lebanon, whatever it may be, that these reservists won't serve immediately? They've said that they will. They've said that they will. Now, I'm not saying there aren't people who oppose what Netanyahu is doing. There are. I'm not dismissing that. But this to me is a PR. I see this as a PR problem more than anything else, including at the senior levels of the IDF. Just finally, what it of course leads to, now that the beginning of those so-called reforms are going through the Knesset, unsurprisingly, is I think Netanyahu and his government, I think the acceleration of the settlerization of the IDF is going to massively increase. And I think what you'll see in the short to medium term is what I talk about in the book, which is a growing but noticeable reduction of so-called liberal Israel from the country itself. Now, obviously, I use that term liberal very loosely. They call themselves liberal. I mean, I don't think they're liberal or progressive, or call it whatever you want internationally. I see this as a growing sign that the so-called Israeli Jewish liberal elites will increasingly not just turn away from Israel, but leave Israel. And those numbers are increasing. They're not all going to get on a plane tomorrow, but that's what's happening, because Israel is becoming less palatable to them, increasingly theocratic, and they want to live under the illusion of a so-called liberal state. And the Supreme Court, in their mind, represents that, in my view, delusionally, but that's what they think.
I'm coming to my last question because I want to open it to the audience. And this is a very interesting one. Could you talk about the fact that people, I think, know that in Israel, feminism is supporting women fighting in the army. And indeed, a lot of women are fighting in the army. And some of them are actually, as your book is reminding us, helping to sell arms. And I'm just going to show one of those sites, which is called Alpha Gun Girl. You mentioned this in the book, and this is real fun. I hope you can see my screen and see how much fun it is to also kill animals, etc. And this is what quite a few feminists in Israel are supporting. Can you talk about that before we open this to the audience, please? I'll stop the share because I think you are getting the idea.
It reminds me of I remember seeing a few months ago, Lockheed Martin, which is one of the biggest arms dealers in the world, having a massive float at a pride rally for gay rights. I can't remember where it was, somewhere I think it was in New York, showing all these women and queer people celebrating the fact that they work for a company, Lockheed Martin, that was incredibly open-minded and progressive on gay rights, maybe ignoring the rather important contradiction there. And I see it exactly the same way in Israel, that there has been a real attempt by particularly younger members of the Israeli Jewish community, generally more conservative, but not only, to show, you go to often Israeli arms fairs and you have young women in the IDF, in bikinis, carrying guns, not that dissimilar to when you go to NRA events in the US. But somehow the greatest expression of feminism is the right to be able to bear arms and join the military. And I think there is something, I mean, it's probably obvious to say this, but there is something, I kind of wish I could have put pictures in the book, and thank you, Haim, for showing that. I didn't, there are no pictures in the book, sadly, but there is something kind of insidious about that, because so much, and I talk about this extensively in the book, a key part of the IDF's social media work, and it's really been a massive part of Israel's outward messaging in the last 15 years or so, since the rise of Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms, is using social media as a key advocate for pushing the message of Israeli equality, so they claim. So you regularly have IDF posts supporting gay rights, women's rights, disabled rights, all the time. And the aim is both to show Israeli Jews themselves, but also an international community, we care about everybody. We care about women. We care about disabled people. We care about marginalized minorities, whoever they may be. And there's kind of a side of me that's not really convinced that this works for lots of people. I mean, maybe some people disagree with me, but I don't really think that a lot of the people that Israel wants to try to get on side, I'm not talking about people who are very pro-Israel, but more sort of liberals or progressive or leftists, call them whatever you want, see that and say, oh, right, well, Israel, supports, the IDF supports disabled people, apparently, and therefore will support Israel. I just don't think that's happening. But a key part of the IDF message is to promote itself as a open-minded, tolerant. I think I remember recently seeing an IDF post on Facebook saying that they're very keen to deliver vegan meals to IDF soldiers in the field. And you go, okay, well, that's lovely, I guess, if you're a vegan. But I see this as kind of this almost like a deluded attempt to try to promote Israel in a way that at a time where its popularity in vast parts of the world has never been lower. But you're absolutely right. There has been a glorification and an amplification of feminism, and clearly an abuse of feminism, frankly, that this kind of messaging is sold. And I think the Israeli social media work, and there's a team of thousands and thousands of people who work on Israel's cyber offensive capabilities. I'm not talking about intelligence, I'm talking about social media. It's a huge part of Israeli weaponry, so to speak. And I'm just not convinced it's actually working. But they don't, if you ask them, they would sort of say that we're trying to show a more liberal, tolerant Israel. And that, of course, is what is the challenge for Israel when you have a far-right government in power that is openly trying to curtail women's and gay rights. I mean, putting aside the irony of the fact that none of this is helping Palestinians under occupation, but within Israel proper, for Israeli Jews, the current far-right government is openly trying to, yes, curtail gay rights and curtail women's rights. And that is a serious problem for advocates of Israel in their moves to sell Israel, as they regularly do, as an oasis for gay rights and women's rights in the Middle East. It's always nonsense. It's always been nonsense, of course, if you're Palestinian, but that's what how they promote it.
Well, I have lots of questions remaining because so many issues are covered by the book. But I now hand over to David. We have half an hour for Antony, and indeed me, if somebody wants to ask me something, to answer questions. from the audience. David, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Haim. Thank you very much, Anthony, for an intensive and an enlightening hour. Very grateful. So now the floor is open to anyone who wants to use the reactions at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll be pleased to take any questions now. And thank you also, Anthony, for stressing that Israeli caring about people distracts from the violent oppression that Palestinians have been suffering for over 7 decades. Fascinating. So, questions, please. The floor is open.
Overwhelming. They were overwhelmed by the talk. There's no questions at all. Here we go.
Here comes one from Bill. Bill, if you could unmute yourself.
Okay, I just almost the last thing that Anthony said, but it really struck me. I wrote it down. You basically said the popularity of Israel in vast parts of the world has never been lower. Can you just elaborate on that? I think I'm particularly interested in where that's taking us. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
I say that, and there's, of course, caveats to that. Let me briefly explain what I mean by that. What I meant by that, though, is that in many countries, let's talk about the US first, that public opinion is shifting, and it's shifting very quickly towards Palestinians. And why do I say that? So there was a Gallup poll earlier this year, I think it was in March or April, which found that for the first time ever, a majority of Democratic voters supported Palestinians over Israelis. And this, of course, I think you can be rest assured that if the poll was taken now, those numbers would be even higher towards Palestinians. I mean, I think the context probably was the new Israeli government at the time, the growing overt racism of that government, coverage in the US of people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, all those kinds of reasons. There's obviously, and I call this a form of a Jewish insurgency of sorts within the Jewish community in America and indeed elsewhere, where you have in general, a generational divide. It's not quite as neat as that, but in general, a generational divide. Growing numbers of young Jews simply don't accept the narrative around Israel. They either disengage entirely, or those who are active join, I'm just saying, Jewish Voice for Peace or groups like that. They're putting pressure if they're involved in their local communities, on local synagogues. They have more critical voices, trying to take people to Palestine. Now, I'm not obviously suggesting that the entire Jewish community is shifting. Obviously, there's still a very strong element that Zionist supports Israel, right or wrong, for sure. And you see similar opinion polls, I just quoted, in the US, happening in parts of Europe as well. The UK, definitely, in Australia, my country, and others. So there is a shift going on. Of course, the counter view to that is that as the global far right increases in popularity and size, many of those groups massively support and endorse Israel. Parts of Europe, indeed also parts of the US, and of course also the evangelical communities, which, although it's not, there are certainly more left, one doesn't read about these much in the media, but they do exist. There are more left-leaning evangelicals who do support Palestinians, but certainly the vast bulk in the US support Israel. And as Israel becomes more hardline and moving towards a form of theocracy, those far-right groups around the world, and indeed evangelicals, are increasing their support for Israel. And I'll say one last point on this. When Israel talks openly about wanting to double the size of the occupation, what I mean by that is they've been talking for a long time, but it's much more overt this year, of trying to have at least 1 million settlers in the West Bank. There's currently 500,000, roughly. Altogether, 750,000 settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, but the Israeli vision, so to speak, is at least 1 million in the West Bank, and frankly more. Israel is facing a problem, though, because they're running out of Jews. I mean, that's the reality. They're running out of enough Jews who will move to these areas. You don't have huge numbers of Jews within Israel itself who will move there. Yes, they do entice some for cheap housing. You don't have a huge amount of Jews moving to Israel for Aliyah, moving there for Jewish reasons. The numbers are relatively small. They haven't hugely increased in the last years. And I do see a real possibility in the coming years of evangelicals becoming settlers. I don't think we're that far away from that at all. Now, obviously, there are some in the Israeli far right who fundamentally oppose that. Don't get me wrong. Now, obviously, these people are not Jewish. I'm well aware of that. But I don't think we're that far away from that. I think Israel, to simply increase its numbers, would potentially accept people who are evangelical. Some may have to convert, some might not. And in fact, even now, there's a huge amount of evangelicals who are going to Israel. They're not living there, but they're going there. They're showing solidarity with the settlements. They're often working on wineries during the Israeli summer. So now, I don't think we're that far away from that. Now, some people may disagree with that analysis, but I've been thinking that for a long time, that Israel is running out of Jews. So what do you do as a state that wants to have even more people settle the West Bank if you don't have enough Jewish people who'll move there? The only group that I can see that would potentially, with inducements and cheap housing and all that sort of thing, are evangelicals, particularly from the US.
I just want to support what you said, Anthony. At Haaretz published this week an interview during the weekend, a very, very long interview with a couple of South African racists, neo-Nazis, and they also are evangelical on top of that, who have just converted to Judaism and moved to Israel as Jews. And
Right.
They said that they are not the only ones. There are people to follow them. And this is the way to go. So I think you've got a worrying thought for all of us to take in, that there are 16 million evangelicals in the United States, and many of them will consider such a move, and this might well happen and compensate for the lack of Jews. By the way, all those Jews that came from Ukraine were taken for a drive and a visit in the settlements, and many of them have already settled there. So this is where it's going to come from.
But the other thing you're reminding me of, Anthony, is that Israel is meant to be a safe haven for Jews, and this increasing cycle of violence seems to undermine that concept.
Well, it's much more unsafe to be a Jew in general in Israel than it is anywhere else. Obviously, there are dangers that Jews face, and anti-Semitism is real. And in certain parts of Europe, particularly, real anti-Semitism, violence against synagogues is a reality. I mean, there's no question about that. And that concerns me, but Israeli policies undeniably worsen that situation for Jews around the world, in my view.
Thank you. We've got another question from Andy. Andy, if you could unmute and show your face if you want to, we'd be pleased to hear from you.
Thank you, David. I found it, and thank you very much, Anthony, for your responses to Haim's questions, which I found very, very enlightening. Just a quick comment on that the last point. I mean, evangelicals are not really a kind of monolithic body. There's a spectrum of views and theological opinions as well. I'm just wondering if evangelicals, at least for some of them, are actually fired by their theological convictions of settling in Israel and seeing it perhaps as a kind of fulfillment of biblical prophecy rather than being motivated by Zionist ideology. It's just a response to your comment. I found it very interesting that the evangelicals, and I think I've met some of them as well in my last trip to Israel. That's pre-COVID. traditionally and historically, there's been a good relations between Israel and Singapore. In your research, have you found out anything more about the chartered industries of Singapore and how they have benefited from the Israeli military complex? Because there's a highly secretive CIS in Singapore that's been shipping and selling arms to, I think, several other countries as well. Something that I'm very, very ashamed of personally.
Thank you, Andy.
Can you comment on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is Singapore wasn't a particular focus of research, so it wasn't like I was ignoring Singapore by any means, but it wasn't particularly a country I looked into. I mean, in terms of Israel selling weapons to Singapore, I think I might mention it somewhere in the book. I can't exactly recall, but the other way round, Singapore itself selling weapons. When I say I have no comment, I simply just I don't know exactly. What I mean, I'm not surprised that that's happening considering Singapore's makeup, but I don't know. I'd rather say no comment than actually have an answer. I don't know.
I'm just thinking about your proximity in Australasia to
Indeed,
to Southeast Asia and whether
absolutely
you came across. Yeah, but
I haven't particularly
for generations now created a huge kind of military industrial complex, which is highly secretive. Within.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
While people are thinking about the next question, can I ask you about the fact that the Israeli military industrial complex, being the largest one, has been privatized and has been leading the privatization. Can you have a few words about this before Diana asked her questions?
One of the things I look at in the book is how Israel has privatized its occupation as well. So for many, many years, the occupation was run purely by the state. And in the last sort of 20 years or so, partly through Netanyahu, but others, they've decided to privatize it, which practically hasn't changed much at all for Palestinians. As I say in the book, it doesn't make any difference to them whether they're stopped or assaulted potentially by a security guard at a checkpoint that's a private entity working for the state, or someone who actually is working for the state, because there's still no accountability whatsoever for the violence. But the privatization, the occupation, to me is interesting. It sort of brought up huge numbers of companies that are now making money from the occupation, from private security at settlements, private security at checkpoints. I mean, the arms industry, just briefly, in Israel was state-run for decades. It obviously is now, as I said before, there's huge amounts of private companies, some of the greatest per capita of anywhere in the world. But as I said, so often those companies are private in name only. They are really arms of the state. So when Israel says we have, hundreds and hundreds of private companies doing what they're doing in the arms industry or the defense industry, they kind of been disingenuous, because as I show in the book, they're really in some ways more assisting Israeli foreign policy agendas, or making so-called friends. I call it transactional friendships with many countries around the world.
Yeah, Antony, I was very impressed with your presentation, and I learned a lot. But what I wanted to ask is, how do you see it's a little bit off topic, how do you see the Israeli economy being affected by the present situation in Israel?
In terms of the arms industry, I would argue no change at all. I mean, obviously, that's looking into a crystal ball of sorts, so I can never be 100% sure, but there's no indication at the moment at all, in fact, that the current political turmoil in Israel is really having any impact negatively on the arms industry. As I said, in 2022, the numbers were the highest ever. The indications are that European interest in buying Israeli weapons is surging, particularly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I would probably suggest, I don't see any indication not that will increase. Clearly though, and there's the one caveat to that is that many international financial bodies have expressed concern this year around the Israeli economy, around what Israel is doing, these so-called reforms, etc. So look, it's obviously possible the economy will partly suffer. And we shouldn't forget, by the way, that Israel is already the most unequal nation in the OECD. Putting aside even Palestinians for a minute, the Israeli Jewish population, 1/4 of Israeli kids live below the poverty line, and is the worst in the OECD, the worst. Now, those figures are probably going to go up, I suspect. I mean, they're already pretty appalling. But in terms of, one of the things that many Israeli Jewish opponents of Netanyahu is saying that, companies are going to move out of Israel, we're going to move somewhere else. Some have started doing that, yes. I don't really see a mass exodus. As I said, the caveat to that, though, as I said before, you already see, and including some Israeli Jewish friends of mine who are against the occupation and work against it, say that if these so-called reforms continue, and clearly they looks like they're going to, you will start having more and more liberal, so-called liberal Jews leaving permanently, leaving temporarily, and Israel then becomes, well, even more of a what it is now, which essentially is a settler-run state. I mean, not every Israeli Jew, of course, supports the settlements, but economically, I think what that'll do is probably force Israel to make far more friends with other like-minded states, not just through the defense industry. The defense industry obviously isn't the only way Israel makes its money. There's various other forms as well. But I think if there's an exodus of many more so-called liberal Israeli Jews, the Israeli state's going to be forced to make more alliances with other nations. And the other nations that come to mind immediately are places like China. China's already friendly with Israel. America is concerned by that so-called relationship, that friendship. And in fact, China has been openly saying in the last while that they're much more interested now in potentially getting involved in so-called peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. Now, on the face of it right now, I wouldn't be optimistic it's going to do much at all, because there are no negotiations at all. But of course, Israel and America was pretty pissed off that Beijing brokered that Iran-Saudi deal earlier this year. Very upset about that. And I mentioned that in relation to your question, Diana, because I think Israel may be forced, as I said, to diversify where it raises money, where it gets capital, and I think there are many nations in the world would be very happy that maybe are not as close to Israel now as they could be, and that could change. I mean, I think there are still enough states in the world that Israel economically is not about to collapse. And also, let's face it, America still gives Israel huge amounts of money every year. And as I said before, I just don't, and again, it's crystal ball stuff here, I just don't really see that radically changing. Even if they cut out the military aid, by the way, there's still lots of other aid that the US gives and other nations. So barring a full-blown sort of theocratic acceleration, which I think is what's happening to Israel anyway, in the short-ish to medium term, barring the theocratic developments massively accelerating, I think Israel will be able to get a so-called stable economy. But there'll be bumps along the road, but I don't think it's going to be an economic collapse, put it that way.
Thank you, Diana. And we've got another question from Jap. Jap, can you unmute and show yourself if you'd like?
As a very modest Jewish activist living in the Netherlands, I'm struck by a phenomenon that seems to be vivid, not only here. I mean the huge gap, to start your video, the huge gap between public opinion and policy making. I mean, there is this model that as activists, we should try to influence public opinion, and then more or less automatically public opinion will influence policymakers, and policymakers will distance themselves from Israel. Now, this doesn't seem to work in any way. I mean, public opinion has shown some shifts. How permanent these shifts are, I have my doubts, but At least they are there. But policymakers react by keeping the dossier even closer to their heart. They seem to be not influenced. On the contrary, the more critical public opinion is, at least that's my impression, the more hardline policymakers becoming and supporting Israel. So this poses a real problem. The whole model of influencing.
That is in this country. We've got any other.
Sorry, the whole model of public opinion influencing public opinion policy making seems to be a very weak model, and I'm looking for a different type of model to influence policymakers. But to be honest, I don't see any other model. So hopefully.
Thank you, Jaap. Let Antony respond.
I do not expect the answer, but at least some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, now you're mostly correct. I mean, obviously you're correct. We can see the impact on the US policy, for example, which is minimal at best. I mean, there's no doubt that's true. But I would say that's the challenge, like anyone who's an activist, to try to put political pressure on the actors to change. That's the case, lots of issues. I mean, the comparison I always make is South Africa. You could say exactly the same thing in 1985 about that issue. The entire Western political elite supported South African apartheid. They all did. Virtually every single major country, US, UK. Now, obviously, South Africa is not Israel. The comparison, they're not exactly the same. I very much understand that. But to me, the challenge is to get far more people in the US Congress who support these views. Easier said than done. Not that I'm idealizing those who were there, but I think there has been a real shift with the presence of people like Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and others. It's changing the conversation. Now, is it changing policy? Not yet. I agree. It's not. But I do think it's changed with really only a handful of people in the US Congress. We're not talking about them. It's a tiny minority, but they have outsized voices, and the media, and I guess social media, gives them traction. That to me does not give me overwhelming hope, but it gives me some hope that there's also an ability to mobilize public opinion and get political action to do so. The Democratic Party leadership relies principally on Jewish donors, not solely, but a lot. And that's clearly an element of why this is so hard to break in that party. Now, I'm not idealizing the Democratic Party by any means, but I do think that there is a generational change happening. I don't want to exaggerate the political possibilities of that, but there is a shift going on generationally. There's no question about that, within the Jewish community and others. So the hope is, and that obviously requires organization in the US, particularly and elsewhere, that there can be greater pressure put on political leadership and elites, and frankly, the media, which is part of that, to change that conversation. I do think that is happening. It hasn't yet really affected policy, you're right, but it is affecting public opinion, more so in the last 5 years than the previous 20 or 30, I would argue.
Thank you, Antony. And moving on to Anton. Anton, if you'd like to unmute and show yourself if you'd like.
Yes, here I am. I hope you can hear me.
Yep.
You can.
Let's see. Now you can even see me. I'm calling from Sweden, and I've been campaigning for Palestinian rights and anti-apartheid since 1982. Which means that it's more than half of my lifetime. I've been noticing that unless there is pressure on governments, economic pressure, as we experienced in 1973, in October 1973, when the oil-producing Arab states had an embargo placed on European states supporting Israel, we don't see anything like it nowadays. And Antony, you mentioned that there are several Arab states that indeed import armaments from Israel. Which ones are they? Why are they doing it? What do they get in exchange? Of course, both those Arab states and Israel are part of the global conservative alliance. They are indeed brothers in arms, both in terms of politics and in terms of clamping down on popular and socialist movements. So what exactly is happening between those Arab states and the Israeli military-industrial complex and polity?
Thanks, Anton.
Thank you for that. Well, the sad reality is that virtually every Arab state is buying some kind of defense equipment or spyware. Who do I mean? UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Saudi. Now, obviously, some of those have official relationships with Israel now under the so-called Abraham Accords, and some like Saudi do not. And of course, as you'll be aware, there's massive pressure on Saudi from the Americans to formalize their so-called friendship with Israel. I mean, that's been in the works for a long time. There was a desire for that to happen under Trump. It didn't happen. There's a desire under Biden. And of course, Saudi have their request for that. They basically want some of America's most sophisticated weapons, and America is currently resisting that to an extent. Saudi apparently is demanding at least some kind of movement on the so-called Palestinian question, although God knows what that would actually be with the current Israeli government in place. And Israel, I think, is in some ways getting the best of both worlds. There's no formal agreement with Saudi right now, but they're still selling huge amounts of weapons to them. So they're benefiting financially. I mean, I think, and I've said this for a while now, that the Palestinian people as a whole have rarely been so lacking in friends in the Arab world. Now, I'm not talking about obviously Arab people here. I'm talking about Arab leaders. I mean, obviously you have a deeply corrupt, horrible, useless Palestinian Authority leadership. I would say that's equally terrible and repressive in Gaza as well, and Hamas, in my view. But putting that aside for a second, I mean, I'm trying to think of one major Arab leader who is doing anything beyond lip service. I'm happy to be corrected if I've forgotten one of them, but I don't see now. You could argue that for decades it was no more than lip service. I mean, that's possibly true, and that's I mean, that sort of self-evidently is a problem. That, you know, one of the things that many of us fear is the possibility of Israel committing another mass ethnic cleansing against Palestinians. Obviously, there's slow-moving ethnic cleansing every day, but an attempt to try to, as many Israeli ministers openly say, finish what we didn't finish in 1948. I mean, they openly say it. And then the question is, well, how would the world react? How would the Arab states react to an attempt to try to push out as many Palestinians as possible? And if, say, Jordan or Egypt or Lebanon are bribed by the US to take in many Palestinian refugees, that to me is conceivable. It's very conceivable. Now, how would the Arab leadership respond to that? I fear fairly positively. The Arab peoples is a different story. To me, the unknown factor in that, apart from the profound immorality and horrific possibility of that, is, to me, it's unclear how the US would respond, not because the US is some bastion of democracy and human rights, they're not, but because the US's role is vital here. If it was a Republican in office, a Donald Trump, someone like a DeSantis, I think it's going to be very grim. If it's a Democrat, I think there is at least the possibility of leverage. And the reason I mention this is that I think many of us have to seriously think about the possibility, as many Israeli politicians and frankly many in the Israeli Jewish population, according to polls, openly want ethnic cleansing. I'm not talking about removing one family here or there. I'm talking about mass ethnic cleansing. This is not some theoretical possibility in 1,000 years. I'm talking about the current Israeli government openly wants that. And unless there is a growing, I think, awareness about what that practically would look like or mean, and how would the international community respond to that, then I think we've got our head in the sand. I mean, this is where, I'm not saying it's inevitable, I'm not saying that, but I think it's certainly much more possible now than it has been for decades. And that's a really scary thought.
Anton, we're coming to an end, but if you've got a quick point you want to make, then
Yes.
please make it.
A very short question, which is technical. How far back in history can you trace the economic relationships, the arms trade between, let's say, Saudi Arabia and the Israeli army or the Israeli state? How far back in history?
Yeah, I think I go back in the book, and correct me if I haven't got the book right in front of me here. I think I go back to at least the 70s. It initially wasn't just so much an arms relationship, but a sharing of intelligence relationship. When even back then, Israel and Saudi were officially, the worst of enemies, right? I think at least the 70s. So a long time.
Okay, thank you, Antony. And as there are no more questions, we'll bring it to an end. A really heartfelt thanks to you both, Haim and Antony. Haim, I don't know if you want any last point, or Antony wants any last point, but if not, I think it's time to close. Thanks to you both. Thanks for all the questions. Thanks for the attendees. Thanks especially to Antony, and best wishes for his book sales, but also for its impact on the vital debate on the future of Israel-Palestine. I do encourage everyone to buy both Haim and Antony's book, both based on meticulous research, both invaluable contributions. So thanks again for everyone, and hope to see you again soon.
I just want to say thank you everyone for attending. Thank you very much for hosting me. It's been really interesting conversation. I'll just say one very, very quick thing, that I don't want to exaggerate this, but since the book came out about a month and a half ago in the US and the UK, but also in Australia and New Zealand, I don't have, book sales, so I'm not saying it's selling millions of copies, but the response has been really quite remarkable. I mean, the idea that, I was interviewed on prime time on MSNBC in America a month and a half ago for 10 minutes about the book. Now, in other words, again, I'm not going to exaggerate the fact that everything is changing. It's not. But there is, I think, a growing openness to these kinds of conversations and a shift. Now, again, as we said before, how does that translate into political action is the question. But I do think there's a growing openness to it. So I've been really pleasantly surprised with how I've got a lot of hate mail as well. That's par for the course for my work. But in general, it's been principally very positive, and I'm encouraged by that.
Good. Pleased to hear it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Antony, and good luck with the book.
Thank you, Haim. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it.
Good.